thanks for joining me. I've got another worm update video. I have 5 bins in my South New Jersey home, and I have 2 bins that are regular totes, 2 bins that are vermi totes, and a vermi bag mini. I like having the different systems because each system presents their own challenge, and depending on if you are a composter yourself, you may enjoy one system type over another. So this is what I like to call the budget bins or the regular totes, because you don't have to do much to start a worm farm just other than getting a 14 or 10 gallon tote. So this is the smaller tote. It doesn't have any holes at the bottom. It's not a double system, but I have my worm colony in here. It was recently harvested. And what I'm battling with in these bins almost all the time and year round is water. These bins do like to hold on to water, and these castings are wet. Now it has been hot. We are going through a heat wave and the temperatures have been above 95, and I find that with my climate and in my house, if the temperatures are above 90, my house is always going to be humid and the worms are going to have a wetter environment. It's not something that I like when the bins are really wet. The worms love it. They like the water. So what I focus on with these bins is cutting down the moisture. So what I'm doing is adding more cardboard. 1, to bring up the level, because I do want to have a larger harvest when I get to the end of the cycle with this one. And 2, to help combat some of the moisture that I am dealing with at this time. So I'm mixing that all in, and I'm taking a very gentle hand. It may not look like it, but I'm not grabbing the castings and being real rough with it. I do want to make sure that the worm colony itself isn't disrupted too much, even though I am fluffing and mixing everything all around. Once I take care to mix that in, I'm going to give them a normal size feeding, but I'm going to give them something that does take a while to break down, like apples. Even though there's a lot of moisture in the apples because they don't break down quickly, it doesn't put a lot of moisture back in. And then I'm going to give them some things that they really do like to encourage them to come to this side, like bananas and watermelon. And then once they've had their feeding for this week, I give them the grit, which is a mixture of eggshell, diatomaceous earth, and neem cake, and then cover it up. I am just going to put the bubble wrap on the side that has the food this week to see if I can get the other side to dry out, and then this bin will be all set up for the next week. So my second of my regular tote bins is the one that I find runs a lot wetter than the first. And this week it did only have the bubble wrap on the side where the food was, but again, a lot more wet than its sister bin. And again, that's why I keep 2 of each, to just see what the differences are, because just because you have the same type of bin for your worms doesn't mean that they're going to run exactly the same when you're going to run into different problems. So again, moisture for both is always a major concern, and that is something I battle constantly. I did get a suggestion from On the Rocks that I should try to put a fan on my bins. So I'm going to try out putting a fan near the bins themselves, but away from the Vermi Bag Mini, since the Vermi Bag Mini tends to run dry, and see if that does help keep the air circulating around in the room. In this room where I am, it is the warmest room in the house. Even though the shades are currently closed, it still tends to be warmer because they have 2 front-facing windows that get sun from the early morning. So, and this is my indoor greenhouse area, so just from having plants and stuff, it does tend to have a little bit higher humidity. So what I'm doing is the same as what I did in the other bin for the same reasons. I'm adding cardboard to this one to increase the bedding, but also as something to absorb some of that additional moisture. And again, using very gentle hands with this, as I don't want to hurt the worms in any way. I'm going to mix in that cardboard and give them the same feeding that I gave to the other bin. Not a very large feeding that I'm giving to this bin, but again, I am pocket feeding, and pocket feeding just means that I'm feeding one side of the bin and then the other side of the bin. So I'm pocket feeding these to encourage the worms to move back and forth across the bin. I mix it up a lot of the times. There isn't a set way that I ever feed the worms. Sometimes I'll put food all across the top. If I want to bring the worms up from the bottom, sometimes I'll just feed them on one particular side and cover them up. So what I'm doing right now is pocket feeding these regular tote bins, but not trying to give them too much of wet foods, which would increase the moisture content in here. And after giving it the worm chow or the grit, I am going to cover this back up, and then this bin is going to be set up for the next week. Moving over to the first of my Vermi bag totes, I left a little space open to see how it would dry. And whenever I leave, no matter how large of a space, it seems like the area is way too crispy for me. I do not enjoy when my bins are that crunchy. So I definitely think the fan is a great idea to try to allow the air to circulate around these bins, because anything I have currently tried either goes to both extremes. Either it's way too dry or way too wet. And again, with these over 90 temperatures, my castings, even in the Vermi bag totes, are wetter than what I normally am accustomed to. And if you've never used a Vermi bag tote, the material for the Vermi bags is meant for water to evaporate out of pretty easily. The sides do not touch actually the sides of this tote. It looks like it, but they don't actually touch the sides. So there's a lot of circulation around it, but it's just the conditions in my home, despite having the air on with the heat, it just seems to hold moisture in this room. So this one as well is going to get some added cardboard to it to try to absorb some of that additional moisture. But I have to keep the bubble wrap on these. I can't do what I do in my other bins by covering half and not covering the unfed side, because this would definitely become an uninhabitable environment for the worms by being too dry. And then I could lose my colony again, which I already experienced and felt terribly for. So after I've added the cardboard to this one, I'm gonna give it a regular feeding just like the other one. It'll get its usual grit, and then this bin will be set up for another week. So don't be afraid to make mistakes with your worm bins, because they're going to happen. And I made a serious mistake. So I covered this with the mosquito netting, which is supposed to let out moisture, instead of covering this with the bubble wrap. And this is crunchy. It's dry. So this is what was left over from the colony that I lost all the worms from. I was hoping they were cocoons or juvenile worms, and I caused this to dry out, which means I have nothing. So I'm just going to take this outside because it really doesn't have anything. I don't even want to sift it because it's so dry. I know there's nothing valuable in it. So I have made yet another mistake with the worms, but this is something that I can definitely learn from. And when I go back and watch my videos, I need to be aware of what I'm doing when I edit to make sure I don't have mistakes like this. Now in my second Vermi bag tote, I have a restarted bin, but this one I'm treating a little bit differently than my other Vermi bag tote. And that's because this is a colony where when I went to bait it, unfortunately, a large part of my colony was just missing. It vanished. The castings weren't dry. And when I go back and look at my videos, I don't see anything that indicated something was wrong. So somewhere between the actual harvest and the first week of harvesting, the worms disappeared. So I took a chunk of worms from my Vermi bag mini, since that has the largest colony, and brought them over here. So I am restarting this colony from the ground up. The castings, I'm trying to be very careful and mindful of what I feed and how much I feed, because I don't want to overwhelm, as this is smaller than any of the other ones. So I'm just going to give this some watermelon and cover it up with grit, and again slowly add material to this colony as I go, making sure to try to keep it nice and moistened, as well as not overfeed or over wet this bin. So this one is a little different, and I'm handling with extreme caution and care, but this one is now set up for the next week. So the last and final bin is my Vermibag Mini, which is my only flow-through system that I have. I really like these flow-through systems because you can give them quite a bit of food and hold quite a bit of castings, and they do very well with that. My only detractor from these things is that they are heavy. When it comes to harvesting, it's kind of hard for me to get down to do the harvest. So I do have another suggestion that I'm going to try when it comes to harvest time, but it's not harvest time for this bin right now. I'm just moving the castings around, and as per usual with the Vermibag Mini, the edges of mine are very dry because the whole bottom of the bag is meant for evaporation. And I find it interesting that the Vermibag totes, I cover them with bubble wrap. All the edges are not dry. It's usually just the area that doesn't have any type of bubble wrap on it. But with the Vermibag Mini, everything that's exposed to the sides is a bit dry. So I'm going to wet this down on this level, which I don't normally do for any of my other bins, simply because they don't usually need it. This bin takes a lot of moisture, and you can tell, so I'm going to put some at the bottom, then give it quite a large feeding in comparison to the other bins. The philosophy I use with the Vermibag Mini is to try to entice the worms to come up to the top, and I do that by making sure the top layer has a lot of moisture and has a lot of food that the worms really like, and also give it some grit. And then on top of this, I'm going to put some cardboard and then give it some more water again to make sure that the cardboard layer is well moistened. It's not a lot of moisture, surprisingly enough, for Vermibag Minis, because they can handle it. But as a precaution, I do have a bin underneath of the Vermibag Mini. That way, if I ever do add too much, which is very rare, I've had the Vermibag Mini now for about 2.5 years, and I've only had leachate come out of the bottom of the Vermibag Mini when it was beginning, when all the material was just at the bottom. Ever since then, I have not had an issue with anything draining through the bag. So the amount of liquid that this can hold is very impressive. And with that, this update is finished for all my worm bins. Thank you for sticking to the end. As always, please like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.